Welcome to Big Tent Live Events, the lockdown live online event series brought to you by Torch, the Oxford Research Centre for the Humanities, as part of the Humanities Cultural Programme, itself one of the founding stones for the future Stephen A. Schwarzman Centre for the Humanities. My name is Wes Williams, and I'm a Professor of French Literature at the University of Oxford, a Fellow at St Edmund Hall, and I'm also the Knowledge Exchange Champion at Torch. The Big Tent Live Event series is our way of bringing together once a week researchers and students, performers and practitioners from across the different humanities disciplines. We're bringing you this event programme online while we're all keeping our distance, and we hope that you're all safe and well during this difficult time. Our aim here is to explore together important subjects and ask challenging questions about areas such as the environment, medical humanities, ethics and AI, the public, the private, and the common good, and we will celebrate storytelling and music, performance and poetry, identity, history, and community. If you'd like to put any questions forwards to our speakers tonight during the event, please pop them in the comments box on YouTube. We encourage you to submit these as early as possible, and I can then ensure that they inform and enrich the Q&A part of our discussion in about half an hour or so. Now, on to our excellent speakers. I'm delighted to welcome into the Big Tent today, Marion Turner, Tutorial Fellow of Jesus College and Associate Professor of English at the University of Oxford, and celebrated author, Matthew Neal. I'll embarrass them a little by saying a little bit more about them before we start the conversation. Professor Marion Turner works on late medieval literature and culture, focusing especially on Geoffrey Chaucer. Her most recent book, Chaucer, A European Life, argues for the importance of placing Chaucer in multilingual and international contexts. She traces his journeys across Europe and his immersion in global trade routes and exchanges. It was named as Book of the Year 2019 by The Times, The Sunday Times, and the TLS, and it was shortlisted for the Wolfson History Prize in 2020. Matthew Neal was born in London, the son of two writers and the grandson of two others. From his earliest years, Matthew was fascinated by different cultural worlds, both contemporary and from the past. After studying at Latimer Upper School in London, he read modern history at Magdalen College, Oxford. And after his university years, he began traveling, seeing diverse cultures at first hand in Asia, Europe, and Latin America. Matthew's books include Inside Rosa's Kingdom, English Passengers, When We Were Romans, An Atheist's History of Belief, and Rome, A History in 7 Sackings. His latest novel, Pilgrims, explores medieval life, shaped by religious laws as well as personal battles. It follows a fascinating Chaucerian cast of characters on a journey from England to Rome. Tonight, Marion and Matthew discuss their recent books, Matthew's novel Pilgrim and Marion's biography, Chaucer, A European Life. They explore the questions raised by each of their differently accented discussions of medieval travel, ranging from colonialism in Wales to the expulsion of the Jews from England, from diplomacy and cultural exchange to holy pilgrimage, both real and imagined. One of the questions underpinning their work, and indeed this conversation today, is that of similarity and difference between times, languages, genres, national, confessional, and political identities, between then and now. Having read most of these two books, I'm sure we're in for a real treat. And so without further ado, I hand over to you, Marion, to get the conversation started. Thank you.
Thank you, Wes. It's such a pleasure to be here and to be talking to Matthew, and I'm really looking forward to the whole discussion and the questions later. But I thought I'd start by asking you, Matthew, why the medieval? I know you've written such a variety of different books, but I think this is your first foray, really deeply into the medieval period. And I wondered what it was that first drew you into the 13th century and made you want to tell a medieval story.
It was really, I'd been researching the history of Rome for my last book, the non-fiction book, Rome, A History in 7 Sackings. And one of the many books that I looked at was about medieval pilgrimage to Rome and I think it was looking at the 13th century in particular. And I'm always interested in journeys, but also in a journey that's made not just for an ordinary reason, but really for in pursuit of an idea. And it occurred to me that pilgrimage was a very interesting subject. And I was rather horrified by the thought of having to write something about the medieval period, about which I knew very little, aside from what I'd just been reading to do with Rome. But I decided that it would be, I'd give it a go. And I had a spare month, so I went to the British Library in London and read everything I possibly could about medieval England and in the 13th century. I actually began, of course, with Chaucer. First I read Chaucer. And when I read the Prioress's Tale, that gave me my date, because I knew that I wanted to write it just before the expulsion of the Jews. And I must say, the whole process of learning about the medieval period was fantastically rich for me. I can see why it's such a popular era, because there's something extraordinary about it. There's a sort of earthiness at the same time. I began to realize that actually it's a very modern era. It's people, the evidence that they had seems very different, but I mean, they were trying to understand the world on less information, but actually the deductions they make are as intelligent as anybody's. It's just they have less basis.
Yes, and I think that often people find that the medieval era is not what they thought it was. So once you find out more, you realize that, I mean, and I think in particular that people, richer people, more educated people, lived in a much more international way than people tend to imagine. So I found that people were very surprised to hear, for example, that Chaucer travelled very widely, that he went twice to Italy, he went to Spain, went very often to France, but also that within England itself, you could, for instance, buy spices that had come all the way from Indonesia, that England was on this kind of global trade route at this time, on the peripheries of these routes that were going right across the known world. And I think that that sense of that actually people could live very cosmopolitan lives is often very surprising for people.
Yes, and in some ways, the island of Britain was more international, more cosmopolitan than it became later, because it was, for many were bilingual, many were trilingual with in Latin, French, English. You had other diverse languages being spoken by large numbers of people, Celtic languages. It's a complicated, fascinating time.
Yeah, indeed. And Chaucer, like all other educated men at the time, spoke English, French and Latin, but also crucially Italian. So, which is, of course, Italy's so important to your book, but the fact that he spoke Italian really enabled him to make enormous changes in English poetry. And because he spoke Italian, he was chosen to go on these diplomatic missions to Italy, and was able then to read Dante, Petrarch, Boccaccio, and reading those poets really changed what he could do in poetry and allowed him to develop new poetic forms. And that really changed what English poetry as a whole could do. So I think that multilingual environment is absolutely so important. And as you say, I mean, that's something that actually we've lost so much, and that now a lot of English people are renowned for their monolingual educations, and a lot of us we end up being very complacent about being able to speak English. But in the 14th century, in my era, people didn't think like that at all. They knew they had to speak other languages if anyone else was going to understand them. But I wanted to go back to your mentioning very early on in your research, you were rereading Chaucer and reading the Prioress's Tale, because of course, one of the things that separates the era of Pilgrims, your book, from Chaucer's era is the expulsion of the Jews in 1290 as a really seismic and appalling event that was a marker in English history. So when I was writing the biography of Chaucer, one thing that I was very interested in was his trip to Navarre in northern Spain now, but then an independent country, because in Navarre he went somewhere where he experienced a kind of multicultural society where there were significant Jewish and Muslim populations as well as a Christian population, and they were all, you know, rubbing along together reasonably successfully at that point. But in England itself, the traces of the Jewish population were still there, of course, in old Jewry and so on. But the Jews, and in kind of anti-Semitic story that, such as the Prioress's Tale, but the Jews had gone. And reading your book, which is set just pre-expulsion, that is really, in many ways, the heart of your book, I think, in some ways.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
Jews. But I wondered if you thought very consciously about the fact that you are juxtaposing voluntary travel with forced migrations in your book.
I suppose, yes. I mean, I think one of the things that fascinated me about the 13th century is that it does seem to be. I read Mansfield's. I'm going to fail to remember a book title now, but the Public Penance. Have you come across that extraordinary book on extreme religion, mostly in France? But she looks at how really people were really controlled by the church in some ways by public shaming in terms of confession and also in terms of pilgrimage. So people actually were often forced to go on pilgrimage. It might be only a pilgrimage to the next door village, or it might be as far as Rome. But I was fascinated by this time of hyper intense Christianity, when people's beliefs were so strong that married couple would fear that they'd go to hell because they'd had sex on the wrong day of the week, where the beliefs were so powerful. And I wanted to reflect that. And that was one of the things I was interested in, was also that one of the characters is actually, he's going to Rome because he's punched an abbot on the nose. And he's obliged to go because otherwise he'll probably lose his property. He'll be tried. It was a time when pilgrimage was both voluntary. For some, it was a kind of holiday. Really, it was an opportunity to enjoy a break and see the world. For others, it was really done out of fear of hell, and for others, it was forced upon them.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting as well. So that sense that there's a spectrum where it might be easy to see the forced migration of the Jews as completely different from, of course, a voluntary trip, but that there are lots of people who were forced to go on these trips, not as brutally as the Jews on their expulsion, but that the sense that people weren't going out of a completely free choice, that people felt impelled to go to expiate their sins. And of course, you've got characters who are doing it because they feel that their sins have caused terrible illnesses in people they love, and if they go on pilgrimage, they might get forgiven. And I think that the way that you get across that people have very different motivations for their journeys is really striking through your really interesting range of characters. You know, that sense that people, they're all going for very different reasons. Some of them very funny, like the cat. Some of them very serious. Yes.
And I suppose I was also interested in how people negotiate the beliefs of their time. So for some, the beliefs of their time are absolutely hard and fast, and they accept them 100%. And others, you can, my reading suggested that there were some people who, even though they were thorough believers in the Christianity of the time, nevertheless had a slight distance between themselves and the beliefs they felt. They had a confidence. These were usually the richer, more educated. They had just a sense of being able to distance themselves a little bit and pursue their own motives or whatever at the same time.
Yes, and I think that across the medieval period, there's always lots of reform movements, some of which turn into so-called heresies and breakaway groups, but some of which are trying to reform the church from within. And of course, in Chaucer's time, you have Wycliffe and Lollardy and a lot of questioning of different elements of church teaching, but also very much of the corruption of church practice, which everyone is criticizing church practice at the time, and that can be a very different thing from actually challenging the sacraments, the corruption that took place, particularly around things like indulgences and pilgrimage, is something that many people were very upset about. And we do see a lot of people criticizing pilgrimage and the idea that it's often taking advantage of the vulnerable in various ways, as I think we also see is being done to some of the characters in your book.
Yes, no, I can see I think there was always a kind of an idealization of the church and a disappointment that it rarely quite met up with the ideals expected. And one can see the Reformation appearing in ghostly form with heresies many times over the preceding centuries. But I also felt that actually my impression was that Catholicism was much broader, much more open, much more flexible. It changes with the Reformation. In these early times, it seems to include all sorts of ideas that were excluded later on, which I also find very interesting.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. That it kind of goes in waves, doesn't it? Where various points there's crackdowns, and then at other points there's a much more kind of liberal and broad sense of what it's okay to believe. And in the 14th century, you have this huge upsurge in vernacular mysticism, where lots of people are trying different ways to have this more personal relationship with God. And then after Lollardy gets going and becomes associated with rebellion, then there's a kind of crackdown in the 15th century. But there is, I think, a lot of variety of belief still in Chaucer's time. I mean, of course, that sense of tolerance within Christianity is then set very sharply in opposition to the brutality that we often see being enacted against other religions, as again, I think you show very powerfully in Pilgrims. But I think also, I mean, one of the other things that I thought was really powerful in Pilgrims was that, as well as writing really interestingly about the relationship between Jewish people and Christians within England and Europe, you also looked at aspects of English colonialism in Wales and wrote about that kind of journeying. So as well as the pilgrimage, which structures your book as a whole, there's also a kind of segment where you're looking at the kinds of journeys that are going on across the English and Welsh border. And I think that, again, it's often easy not to think about the colonialism of this era because so much attention is given to the colonialism of later eras. But it's very important for us to think about the different waves of takeover that have happened in these islands. And I just wondered if you wanted to talk a bit about why it was important to you to emphasize that aspect of Englishness.
Well, I think it was partly the timing, because this was the year I'm writing about comes so soon after the annexation of North Wales, of the Kingdom of Gwynedd. So I think but initially I think I was just going to refer to it through the English pilgrim characters, but then it seemed so important that I realized I felt I had to have a completely different perspective on it all, from a Welsh pair of eyes. And I think I was also drawn to it because in an earlier novel, English Passengers, I was looking at the British in Australia, and I was struck that the process was rather similar in many ways. A lot of it was less about a grand plan and more about individual careers, which people would try and add to their status by going somewhere else, and with often vast consequences for the people who happen to be in the somewhere else. But the early 19th century Tasmania and late 13th century Wales seemed really more similar than I would ever have expected.
Yeah, I think I find that very striking, that the comparison that you're making there, because I mean, I really loved your earlier book, English Passengers, and I think the way that these two books, set in very different eras, do show kind of recurring patterns is extremely interesting. I think it also reminds us of the changing nature of borders, that people tend to think about England and Great Britain and the British Isles as much more fixed than they really are. So that back in Chaucer's day, that of course at that point the English king ruled lots of different parts of France as well, ruled Aquitaine, Calais, and those borders were changing all the time, as well as the border with Scotland, the border with Wales, the things that were going on in Ireland. You know, that these things were changing all the time. People didn't have the sense of a nation state that that people tended to get in later eras. I mean, one thing that I found was when I was getting the maps drawn for my book, it was so difficult for me to get the Europe map, because I had to decide at what point am I going to freeze the map, because I can't have a map of this is Europe during Chaucer's life, because it wasn't the same across his whole life. You know, the borders changed so many times, so you had to kind of pick a date and say, okay, well, it's going to be after this treaty and before that treaty, so that I'm going to put the borders here, because they changed all the time.
No, and I felt that came across very strongly in your book, was some things are very familiar. There are political figures who basically can whip people up against foreignness and people who are seen to be unscrupulous, foreigners causing trouble, and self-serving individuals, which seems a very modern political approach, sadly. And at the same time, you have much more openness towards Europe than one finds in later centuries, I would say. Maybe in part, I'm sure, because a large part of the ruling elite was so involved with Europe that they were coming and going, that they, as you said, the kingdom stretches across the channel. And I feel that it was a very different England after the Reformation, the Spanish Armada. A new identity becomes fixed, in which Europe is purely something other and perilous and a threat, really.
Yes, and I think part of that, as you're perhaps implying with that post-Reformation marker, is that kind of Catholic Europe in particular becomes defined as Southern Europe broadly becomes defined as very other to the kind of the Protestant North, kind of culturally, whereas for much of the medieval era there is still that pull to Rome and to that sense of Christendom, which of course some people are very, you know, get very antagonistic towards Rome, but there is that general sense of being part of that bigger picture. And I think that the sense of there being a kind of identity where people did think of themselves as being Europeans is important. And I suppose that in general, I'm not talking about the peasantry, the ordinary people, but the people with whom Chaucer was mixing, that if you were at court throughout Chaucer's lifetime, there were three different queens. You know, one came from Hainaut, one came from Bohemia, one came from France, and they brought their retinues with them. of people who brought their poetry and their art from all different places in Europe. And when Chaucer, traveled around Europe, he would meet people that he knew from the English court and who had connections with people that he knew. When he went to Navarre in northern Spain, as I was saying before, that there were some things that must have seemed very alien to him, the fact that there were these Jewish and Muslim communities there. But the king was a French-speaking king who had been a patron of Machaut, the great French poet, who was one of Chaucer's great influences. That there was a kind of international culture that went right across lots of different European cities. And I think when Chaucer was reading texts written from all over Europe, those texts are all connected in different ways. I mean, one thing that I find very interesting is that when Chaucer chose to write in English, he was following a European fashion because he was really following the Italian desire to write in their Tuscan vernacular. So what seems to be a very nationalistic thing to do was conversely quite an international thing to do as well. And I think that's really interesting. But I think also one of the things that I'm fascinated by is not just thinking about that highest level of culture, but to the kind of court culture, but that really for Chaucer, even more importantly, was the kind of city trading cultures that were stretching across Europe and the rest of the world. That's where we see so much exchange happening with the products that were traveling from all over the world. And I find that very interesting, thinking about where did objects come from? Where did the metals come from that English money was made of? Where did the fabrics come from that they were making cushions out of? The way that things were traveling back and forth. And I think that's a really, really interesting thing to think about, that constant exchange. There was English wool going out all over Europe at this time.
Yes, no, it's fascinating, and I suppose really it's a time when. Sorry, I'm losing myself here. I had a thought and it's gone.
Well, while you're getting that thought back, one thing that I want to make sure I have time to ask you about is the way in which you researched 13th century Rome, because I felt like I learned so much from your Rome chapters, and it helped me to imagine medieval Rome in a way that I've never been able to so vividly before. The texture of your writing was really brilliant, I thought. But I'd really be very interested to hear what you did. Did you walk around the places? How much of the traces of medieval Rome can you still find? Because I know you live in Rome yourself.
Yes. Well, I'd written this book which looked at medieval Rome. It's based on 7 sackings, so I was focusing on Rome before 1084, when the Normans had sacked Rome a bit. And I think I just read everything I could. There's a marvelous book by Krautheimer on Rome from the age of Constantine right through to the age of the 14th century, really. And that has tremendous detail. But also Rome is spoiled, so there's a lot of things still here. You can find them still, sometimes where you wouldn't expect to find them. So this era, really, Rome was, it was like a kind of vast San Gimignano. It was filled with fortified towers, partly for defense, but mostly for status. Everybody wanted one. So there's one near Piazza Navona, which is still marked as the Miller's Tower, because it was obviously a successful miller, and if everybody else was going to have a tower, he was going to have a tower too. And some of these towers are actually half lost in the structure of later buildings. So if you look carefully, you'll see a corner of a 19th century building that doesn't match, and you realize it's an old tower that has been surrounded by later accretions. And no, I read everything I could, and Krautheimer was particularly great on that, and just tried to reimagine what it would have been like.
Well, I love that sense of finding the tower with the 19th century bits stuck onto it. I mean, because one thing that I found very important for me when I was researching the biography was to try to do some of that kind of footstepping, trying to follow in Chaucer's footsteps, trying to see what still remained of the things that he had seen, the art that he'd seen, the buildings he'd seen. And I mean, one of the a very striking moment for me, similar to what you're describing there, was when I went to Milan and Bernardo Visconti's great palace and church. There's just this little bit, it's called something like San Giovanni in Conca, something like that, and it's on a traffic island now. You know, so it's just, and then you find this kind of little remnant. You can go down into the crypt, but then you come up and there's just traffic roaring past you, and it's this kind of strange little trace, but there is that trace still there. But you know, then you go to other places where everything seems to be so perfectly preserved. You know, you really enter into the or you feel like you're entering into the medieval past, but much more often, I mean, as you see very much in London, the traces of the different eras are all piled on top of each other, and that's very kind of energizing as well, kind of the ways in which what you can pull out from under those traces.
Yes, and Rome is spoiled in that respect, in that the Romans tend to leave things, and so even though some things have been destroyed, an awful lot has survived. Milan, I think, has had a rougher history, so there's much less to see. But it looked like you did very well in Navarre. You found a lot up there.
Yeah, I mean, that was a really interesting journey. I think that journey of Chaucer's has been very much kind of neglected, and people hadn't thought very much about it. And one of the very striking things for me was going to Olite and finding that street of the Jews that was leading up to the palace where Chaucer's safe conduct was issued. But one of the things that I did on that trip was I went at the same time of year that Chaucer went. So I went in February, and I thought this was a slightly kind of silly thing to do probably. But then when I was in Roncesvalles, you're in the kind of the mountain passes, and it really helped me kind of imaginatively to try to enter into his experience, because there I was in this kind of misty little town in the mountains. And then I thought, gosh, imagine if I'd ridden here, you know, over the Pyrenees, and there were bears and wolves, you know, really, you know, try to think about what that must have been like in winter. And you know, the experiences that he had as a traveller, that, I mean, that was what I think one extraordinary experience. You know, another one was that he was taken prisoner when he was just a teenager, and he was ransomed, and you know, so many really interesting, you know, different kinds of journeys. But I think that if I can just move back to your book and think about the different kinds of journeys that you're talking about, because also I think the journeys are very different depending on the person who's going through them. And I was really, you know, pleased to see that you focused a lot on women, on female characters as well as male characters in your book. And I just wondered if you'd like to talk a little bit about your kind of Marjorie Kemp inspiration.
Yes, well, I mean, I think the characters were inspired by either people who reasons for going on a pilgrimage, or real people who I read about. And Marjorie Kemp, obviously she's a major figure because she's the first English woman person who did an autobiography. And she's a phenomenal figure, rather irritating in many ways, but phenomenal. And at the same time, I also came across Lucy de Tweng, who I used as Lucy de Bourne, and she was just such an extraordinary figure. I think I came across her in one of various periodicals initially, and then I read everything I could about her. And her life was so extraordinary, and it also said a lot about medieval divorce and the whole process of medieval law, which was so different and seemed so complicated. And I found that all fascinating too.
Yeah, and I think it's fascinating when you do see that some medieval women, often the more privileged ones, but they were able to carve out quite a lot of independence for themselves, that the inheritance laws were often quite good for wealthier women and things like that. But again, I think is
well,
often surprising for people.
The wife of Bath, I mean, I'm sure that she had an eye on the fact that she could enrich herself and did so.
Yeah, absolutely. That she's able to inherit very well from her first three husbands, and then she can please herself more with her later husbands, which wasn't the case in all European countries. That inheritance laws were different for different women. But I mean, I think that it would be wonderful to go on talking forever. I think it's time for us to see if there's any questions for us. So I'm going to hand over to Wes, who hopefully will have some questions for us now.
There are indeed many questions. Thanks ever so much for starting this debate going. And I have a whole bunch of questions fed through to me here from listeners and viewers. And I might start with where you just ended. In other words, to the question of the women's role in both of your stories, actually. So if Chaucer's famous for, well, one of the things Chaucer's famous for is precisely the Wife of Bath's tale, or the kind of the degree to which he gives voice to women. And of course, as Marion said, women are central to your story, Matthew. But there's one questioner, Charlotte Cooper Davis, said that she's intrigued by something that Marion said about pilgrimage being criticized as something that was done to the vulnerable, which may or may not include women. Can you say something more about that? Do you remember having said that? Pilgrimage is a kind of thing that's imposed on people, done to the vulnerable. It goes to the question early on about voluntary travel as opposed to forced migration, I guess, as well. Any thoughts on that?
So I think that pilgrimage was usually criticized really because it was seen as a holiday for people. So the main way in which we see pilgrimage being criticized is the sense that people they were going on pilgrimage not because they were devout, but because they wanted to get away from their ordinary lives and they wanted to have some fun. And there certainly were people for whom that was true. So there are various texts which talk about women going on pilgrimage and coming back pregnant and that kind of thing. And so there are critiques of pilgrimage that say, everyone's just enjoying themselves. And of course, a really important thing about Chaucer's pilgrimage, as opposed to the pilgrimage that Matthew depicts, is that Chaucer's pilgrims don't get there. It's all about the not about the destination. I think the point that I was making about vulnerability was a slightly different one, and maybe I wasn't quite clear. But there I was talking about the idea that some people were not choosing to go on pilgrimage out of their own free will, but the idea that some people were feeling very much like they had to go on pilgrimage, that they were not going to have their sins forgiven if they didn't go on pilgrimage, that they had no other choice, even if it was going to cause them all kinds of personal or financial difficulties. They had to go, and there's lots of evidence of people trying to get out of going, making a vow to go on pilgrimage, for instance, when they're going through something terrible. And then later, not wanting to do this anymore, or having a new husband who said they couldn't go, but feeling they were still bound by their vow and trying to work out what they could do. And better off people would sometimes pay someone else to go for them, for instance. But
proxy pilgrims, effectively. Yes. Matthew, did you want to say anything about this question of vulnerability?
Yes, well, just my impression when I was researching this was that most pilgrims were reasonably well off, which may be part of the accusation that this was really a form of long-distance holidaying. But I also think that there were some who were much poorer, but it was quite tough. I mean, you could beg your way, and it was acceptable to do this, but it wasn't an easy option. And most pilgrims who went somewhere like Rome were, as the characters in the Canterbury Tales, they weren't penniless.
No, or they were sponsored, or there was a kind of degree of people got together, again, as your novel shows, but also as your book shows in relation to Chaucer. And I declare an interest. I've written a book about 16th century pilgrims, where again, proxy pilgrims and people being sponsored by their friary or their particular area. And to stay with the question of vulnerability, and then this is part of your book as well, Matthew. Somebody asks, how did unwell or disabled pilgrims travel? And you have a number of unwell pilgrims in your story. Do you want to explain why you focused, if you like, on those, on the sort of pilgrimage as cure, or as in relation to disease and in relation to the various kinds of unwellness?
Yes, and it was very common, as it is still today, and people go to Lourdes for that exact reason. And I think because the assumption was that if you were unwell or one of your family were unwell, it was their own fault, really, because they must have sinned, because there could be no other explanation. Mm-hmm. I mean, the only difficulty I had was that they're going to Rome, and that wasn't really the classical destination. If you were sick, you went to Rome to get rid of to reduce your time in purgatory, really. Mm-hmm. You went there because to ease your sins, or to get St. Peter to charm God into letting off your time in purgatory. Mm-hmm. So, but no, I think people would go to tremendous lengths on probably more. I mean, people would go to St. Fridarswide in Oxford, yep, to try and find a cure through pilgrimage. And some of the scenes in these places must have been, to our eyes, would be very, very distressing, I suspect. Mm. Of very sick people struggling to get to a destination in difficult circumstances.
Yeah, and Marion, did you want? Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, I should say that the opening of the Canterbury Tales talks about the fact that people are going, the holy blissful martyr for to seek that hem had holpen one that they were seeker. So they're going to seek Thomas a Becket, who's helped them when they were sick, when they were ill. And there's that sense that this is both physical illness, but also spiritual, moral illness. And as Matthew is implying, those two things are often seen as going hand in hand. So you're seeking a cure for your sins or for your physical ailments, and that's seen as trying to get a rebirth. And so that opening of the Canterbury Tales is set in the time of, in April, in springtime, Easter, the time where you can be rejuvenated, reborn in imitation of the resurrection of Christ. And that's seen as something which is curing your soul and curing your body. And of course, there's all kinds of problems for that. I think, as we also see in Matthew's book, how awful that is for the sick people who are seen as sinful.
Yep. Another question has to do with sort of percentages, and it's very hard to do this, I know. But you said right at the beginning, Marion, that there's a sort of educated elite, shall we say, that are moving around much more than we realised in the medieval period. Do we have any notion of what percentage of people are likely to have been on pilgrimage across this period?
Well, I can't give you a number right now, but I think that it's really important to emphasize the fact that there were lots and lots of different ways of going on pilgrimage. So many people would have gone on a local pilgrimage. So you can do local pilgrimages within a day, for instance, very likely. There are pilgrimage sites everywhere, all kinds of little local shrines and figures. And so there's the very local pilgrimages. Then there's pilgrimages, a little bit further afield. Just within England, there's so many major pilgrimage sites, ranging from Durham to Walsingham to Canterbury, lots and lots of different sites. And then those things, even the Great Canterbury Pilgrimage, is still much more accessible than the great European pilgrimages and further afield to Santiago de Compostela in Spain, Rome, and then Jerusalem and the Holy Land. There's lots of other, of course, places as well, but those are the major ones. So, I mean, I can't give you a number, but not that many people would be going to Jerusalem, but a huge number of people would be going to local shrines on local pilgrimages.
Right. Okay. Yes. So then, even if we can we need to rethink our understanding of who could travel in the medieval period. And again, it's the same in the Renaissance. I was amazed at how many people did travel around, both local pilgrimages and long distance pilgrimages in that period. The sort of local shrine, whether it's a shrine for cure or for various other kind of ailments, people clearly moved around a lot more than we imagined. You've got this notion of people stuck in their villages and never really going anywhere.
No.
Is that what you discovered as well, Matthew, in your research?
Yes, definitely. And also, I mean, it was more organized than one would think. I mean, the Venetians had these wonderful package
they had travel agents, effectively, didn't they? Yeah.
You just paid up front and everything was included, all your meals and the tour of Jerusalem and the side trip off to wherever it was, Jericho, or it was surprisingly modern and very efficient. And generally, their ships didn't sink, they weren't captured by marauders, everything worked fine. Occasionally, the Genoese had a reputation for sometimes selling their pilgrims into slavery, but the Venetians were very reliable.
Yeah. Has your researches, either of you, inspired you to go on pilgrimage yourselves? And if so, has it changed your perception of the practice, or have you kept, as it were, your distance from actual journeys as opposed to imagined ones?
So I haven't done a pilgrimage, but I did lots of actual journeys when I was researching the book. So when I was researching Chaucer European Life, that was a really important part of my research for me, and not only because luckily he went to places like Florence and
what's not to like.
It's a tough job, but someone's got to do it. But seriously, I found it extremely useful to go and try to walk those streets because I organised the biography through places and spaces. It was hugely important for me to try to reconstruct those spaces in my own head, and to try to to go into London and find the church where his daughter's monastery had been, that kind of thing, and then to sit there and look around and work out what had been there in the 14th century, or what had been there and was now gone. And often those local trips, as well as the ones further afield in Europe, I couldn't quite put my finger on why it had been so important, but something changed for me in my process of understanding Chaucer's life and his imagination when I went on those trips. I haven't done a pilgrimage, but I must say I've thought about it. I feel that when I have more time, I would be I think particularly doing something like walking that route to Santiago or something. I can imagine how that is a very kind of mindful thing to do.
And Matthew, all you need to do is go out of your front door and you're already in Rome.
Yeah, it's true. Yes, in that respect, yes. No, it's I've never gone on. I'm not a very religious person, so I've never thought of going on a pilgrimage. I used to love walking. And I did a lot of some huge walks. So I'm used to the sort of rhythm of walking. And I think in this case, I just knew I wouldn't have the chance of walking any of this. So I just researched everything I could. I read accounts by people, even quite recently, who had done the walk to Rome. And I researched, obviously, all the places they're going off to. And I was quite shocked to discover that the pilgrimage route across France, as far as it's known, because it's not known as exactly as one would think, is pretty much the line of the trenches in the First World War.
Ooh.
So again and again, I would find references to a splendid medieval town that had been blasted to bits by artillery. And it was just a very strange, rather eerie coincidence to think that these pilgrims were effectively walking the trenches that would appear centuries later.
That's a very nice segue, if I may, to the next question, which is part of our the title for today's session is Pilgrimage, Diplomacy and Colonialism. And in a way, each of your books is about layers of place as well, isn't it? About how exactly the same place might at another moment become a different kind of place. And that example you've just given us, Matthew, is extraordinary. I wondered if, so within your novel, the colonial side of the question is principally around England and Wales.
Yes.
The annexation, as you said, of North Wales, or what's now North Wales, if you like, in particular. Again, I just sort of offering the chance to each of you to reflect a little more on colonialism and the degree to which the practice of pilgrimage overlaps with or is distinct from the practice of colonialism, either within Europe or more broadly. I mean, most obviously when it gets to the Crusades, perhaps, but more broadly. Have you thoughts on that? Let's start with Marion this time.
Yeah, I have lots of thoughts on that. So
I imagined you might.
I mean, I think that Crusaders often called themselves pilgrims and really blurred the boundary between crusading and pilgrimage in a way that might, seem extremely surprising to many of us. But once you think about it, of course, you can see why, with their particular motivation, they did think like that. So I think that particularly, pilgrimage to the Holy Land was very much bound up with often with a militaristic mentality and with that sense of actually taking over those spaces in a way that, you know, other pilgrimages, I think, were often quite different to that, you know, that people were not going on pilgrimage with that sense of taking the lands over. I think that Holy Land pilgrimage was quite different. But I think that in terms of thinking more broadly about colonialism, that there's lots of different ways in which we might think about colonialism and different kinds of migration. So, I mean, it's quite a small part of my book, but one of the things that I think is very interesting is that so Chaucer's first employer, Elizabeth de Burgh, was married to Lionel of Clarence, who then also became Chaucer's employer, and Chaucer went with him to fight in France, where he was ransomed, as I mentioned a few minutes ago. Now, Lionel went on to a governorship in Ireland and implemented the statutes of Kilkenny, which were, you know, notorious and appalling colonial laws in Ireland that prohibited the use of the Irish language by many people, prohibited intermarriage and native sports and all those kinds of things. And, you know, one thing that I thought was very interesting when I was thinking about that moment in the 1360s when he did that was that English at that moment has become the colonial language that is oppressing the native languages in Ireland. And we see, you know, Matthew demonstrates the way that is being done in Wales as well in the 13th century. But within England, for Chaucer, English was itself the native language that had been oppressed by the colonial languages of Latin and French, you know, hundreds of years earlier. So I thought the fact that you know, the language meant something very different in different places was really important for thinking about the fact that England had been a country that was repeatedly taken over for hundreds of years, and then it became the colonial aggressor in its turn, and what the language meant in different places and what it means in different places, you know, in our era as well, it is really finely tuned and varied.
Thank you. That's a very rich response. Matthew, do you have, I mean, as Marion says, English and Welsh are in a sort of conflict in your story. And the Welsh character, again, I don't want to give too much away about it, but the Welsh character finds a kind of liberation once he's in a non-English speaking world, and adopts all sorts of other identities, discovers that actually pretending to be Dutch, let's say, is much more useful than saying I'm English. And I suppose there it's a question, is that also part of a sort of colonial understanding of the English as a particularly brutish race, or is that just a part of?
I'm very fond of the English. I'm English myself, so no, I wasn't trying to have a go at the English. I was just fascinated by this moment, and it was that particular moment, the annexation of North Wales was very brutal, and it was brutally done. And I found something. There was a kind of curious and rather terrible mixture of brutality, careers, search for status, taking over land, and romance, because this area was also the land of King Arthur. So you had Edward I and his queen wandering around on a tour of the Arthurian sites, romantically enjoying these, and feeling that these were really their property now, their cultural property, because he was now the Prince of Wales, or that he was claiming the Welsh throne. And I found that all rather slightly distasteful. At the same time, I mean, I suppose we're talking about a time when people are moving away from Latin, and in a way, there is a new division occurring in Europe, because Western Europe really had a true lingua franca, which it's never had since, which is, there was no question of whether one language should predominate. There was always a language which a very large number of, certainly the more educated people, could speak anywhere from Poland to France to Italy to Scotland. And it was, I mean, you can see why that was not going to last forever, but it must have given a unity to Europe which has never really existed since.
it's interesting because there are two stories, which again, one of the questions asks a version of this. There's two stories here. One is about how there was this lingua franca and therefore a unity to Europe. And then another one is, oh, but English was so multicultural and multilingual that it was connected to Europe. And I mean, I'm not saying these two things are in conflict with each other, but both of those stories suggest that somehow the Reformation was a defining moment, and therefore that your books are placed at a moment of English history before various things broke. Most obviously, in your case, the expulsion of the Jews, but also a kind of loss of a multilingual connectedness to Europe. Is that too much of a grand narrative history for you?
That was the impression when I was trying to read about England at that time.
Right.
That was the impression I got. I mean, there's always a tension between the local and the international in any society, in any place. And certainly there was in England at that time, as Marion so clearly demonstrated with in her book. But I think there was, and that tension may have been slightly greater in England just because it was an island, or Britain because it was an island. But I do feel it was in some ways a more broader, a more international looking place than it became in the next century or two.
Would you want to argue that too, Marion, or is there resistance?
I think one important issue is that this works differently depending on your class and your gender and your background, so that when people are writing all their texts in Latin, then there is this wonderful way in which you can speak across borders, and there's obviously huge benefits to that. Once you start writing in the vernacular, you lose some of that, but you're able to speak to a broader demographic within your own country, so a slightly broader range of classes, and usually more women as well as men. And that's what people such as Boccaccio in Italy and Chaucer in England are able to do. But whatever linguistic choice you make, something is lost, isn't it? Because you're choosing which kinds of audiences you're going to access. So I think that there absolutely was a moment now when someone such as Chaucer is able to speak and read in so many languages. So he himself is able to connect with all these people within England. Of course, it's still a relatively small group in a manuscript culture. And he's also able to read text written from all over Europe. He's not your typical English person at this time. But I think it is true that educated people at this time were able to, very much to be reading texts across borders. And that's certainly something that does get lost. But I think Englishness, as we were saying before, it does start to mean something very different once Rome is perceived as an enemy rather than as the ideal destination as it is in
Yes. No, it's different Europe, I think.
Okay, well, again, thank you, Sarah Davis, for the question that generated that bit of the discussion. I think we've time for 3 or 4 more questions. Some of them, let's go for some of the more punctual, straightforward questions, if you like. Are there any unexpected diaries of 13th century pilgrims that have been discovered recently, or has all this stuff been known for a long time? Are there still treasures in the archives?
I mean, I'm sure there are still treasures in the archives. I can't think off the top of my head of a recent discovery of a diary. There's certainly lots of documents, interesting documents that are still discovered. So, for instance, just in the last few years, new documents have been discovered about Marjorie Kemp, the 15th century woman who we were talking about before, for instance. But I'm sure there's still lots of records about Chaucer in archives around Europe that haven't been found.
Yes, on pilgrimage, I think what's surprising is that there are so few detailed sources. We still don't really know exactly where the pilgrims would have walked on their way to Rome. Marjorie Kemp's very valuable, but she tends to have her own priorities, so she doesn't always say where she was exactly. No, I was surprised to find how little information there was.
Thank you. Another sort of archival question, which is, are there particular anecdotes from Chaucer's life, Marion, that is your sort of favourite story that you didn't know before you started, but that you discovered afterwards?
Well, everyone's favorite story from my book is the story of the Poltalk, I think. So that the first life, so we have lots of life records of Chaucer because he was a civil servant and the English have good bureaucracy. And the first source that we have tells us not anything that is particularly important, it seems. It just tells us that his employer bought him some clothes. But I started to look into what these clothes were. So the Poltalk, these two-coloured hose, these shoes that he was bought by Elizabeth de Burgh when he was a page boy. And I found out that these were scandalous items of clothing. So this was a complete surprise to me when I found out that at the time, lots and lots of chroniclers were writing about these outrageous items of clothing, were saying this is disgusting. Young men are wearing these short tunics that are exposing their buttocks, and they're wearing these tight hose. And one chronicler even said that this was why the plague had returned to England in the 1360s, because young men were dressing in such a disgusting and outrageous way that God was punishing the English. And so, obviously this is a funny anecdote, but I also thought it was really interesting because on the one hand, you have this sense of, oh, they're just like us, teenagers dress inappropriately and older people, tell them off about it and say everything, young people of today. But on the other hand, this is a very unfamiliar way of living because this young boy is not choosing these clothes. His employer is dressing him. He is being paid in clothes and food. He doesn't have his own room. He doesn't have his own money. He's paid in kind. He has to live in a public way. He doesn't have a private identity. So for me, that really sums up what for me is fascinating about the medieval period, which is that tension between familiarity and difference.
Thank you. Matthew, perhaps a more sort of focused question for you, which is, again, I don't want to spoil the book, not least because, as I've confessed to you earlier, I haven't quite finished it yet, so don't tell me the end. But there is this very strong story of the two Jewish characters in it, who connect us to the larger narrative of the expulsion of the Jews from England. And again, one of the questioners asked, because you said in your when you were just talking earlier that once you realized, if you like, that was the date, then you had your date, that you knew when you wanted to tell your story was just at that moment. Can you just say a little bit more about why is that the moment to focus on for you?
I suppose I was interested in this lost part of the island's history, really. And also, I suppose I was aware, I mean, my mum was Jewish. I never really feel very Jewish, but she had her own history. And I felt there's a sort of rather depressing feeling around in these days that things that we thought we'd got rid of were all resuming and returning. And I suppose I was very aware of that. And this seemed, sometimes I feel it's better to look at things in a slightly roundabout way, rather than just sort of wave a flag or wave, I don't know. So I thought that made me more interested in it all.
Thank you. And again, perhaps the last question is around the question of voice. Clearly, one of the things that sort of connects some of your different novels, Matthew, is the question of voice and the degree to which one might adopt a voice. Now, there aren't 20 of them in this novel, but there are still nonetheless some quite distinctive voices. And I said right at the beginning that there's something Chaucerian about that, insofar as the Canterbury Tales, tells stories from particular perspectives. Was that something that you consciously wanted to sort of make a connection to Chaucer, or is us bringing you, or is you and Marion deciding to talk about these things, making things clearer to you than they were at the beginning? In other words, are you writing a version of the Canterbury Tales in some sense?
No. I mean, I think it was because I'd used the same approach in this other novel, English Passages.
Yes. But
I think I was very interested in what was said in Marion's book. What Marion said was really that Chaucer's interested in people giving the reader a choice, really. And you contrasted that with Dante, and I felt that was in English Passages. I wanted to slightly offer readers a choice. And I think if you lecture readers and with a standpoint, a viewpoint, then there's a danger that they'll just rebel and get very fed up with you. If you give readers a choice, then obviously you're going to favor certain aspects of that choice, but nevertheless, people may feel more open to finding their way in what you're saying or what you're thinking about. Mm-hmm. And that was very much what I wanted to do with this book as well. And I was fascinated to see that Marion felt that was Chaucer's approach as well. But I think it's a valid one because nobody likes being lectured.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, you know, one of the cornerstones of Chaucer's approach is to try to get across this sense that what you see depends on where you are standing. So that every perspective is partial and relative, so that it's never enough just to have one perspective. And that's really the essence of the Canterbury Tales, is this sense that we need to see things from different points of view and then make our own decisions once we've thought about it from more than one standing position.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That seems like a good question to end on, or point to end on, but I've got one more for you. And that is that it's the difference, if you like, or the kind of voice or choice involved in writing fiction or non-fiction. So Matthew, you've written both. Marion, I have no idea whether you have a lot of novels in your top drawer that you haven't, but I do know that you're interested in collaborating, for instance, with the theatre companies and so on. So again, just to end really as a way of sort of turning our conversation into a broader question about, to encourage you to reflect on the difference between fiction and non-fiction, precisely in the way of enabling people to stand in the place of the other, or to understand what it's like to be someone else, which is effectively what both of you were talking about at the end. Matthew first.
I think my main concern is to find an idea or a subject that seems worth writing about. That's always the major problem. And after that, then sometimes I've found myself wondering whether they should be fiction or non-fiction. And in fact, the History of Rome book actually was initially, briefly, tried to write it as a novel, disastrously. So I think there is yes, I don't think it's always as easy to decide how to do these things as one might think.
Marion.
Yeah, well, I suppose, I mean, I always write non-fiction, but I'm always writing about fiction. So, and I think that, I mean, writing biography, so this is the first time I've written biography, and I found that a really fruitful form for me, because you are able to do lots of different things. So to think about history and literary criticism and art history and lots of different kinds of approaches. And I think you have to do a certain amount of imaginative work when you're trying to make those imaginative leaps into the past and into someone else's life. But for me, there were real limits on what I felt was appropriate for me to do as a biographer, as a serious biographer. And so, I was wrestling a lot with the issues of, when do you say, well, this must have happened, and when you don't really have evidence for it, and I think that I decided really to think much more about Chaucer's imagination than about his emotional life. And there was a moment when I decided to put a footnote in the introduction where I just kind of said, I'm not going to write about his emotional life. I don't think that when you're writing about a subject for whom you do not have private letters and private diaries, and you can't interview their grandchildren, when you're writing about someone from the 14th century, I just don't think I can get to the what did he really think about his mother kind of aspect. And once I put that footnote in, it was really liberating. I thought, okay, right, I'm not doing that really, and and then I was able really to think much more about his imagination. And so I suppose that I think it was there is a real boundary for me between what's appropriate to do when I'm writing non-fiction. But of course, as I say, the essence of my interest is always in what it means for him to write fiction.
Thank you both so much. I think it's time to draw things to a close. And I wanted, as I say, to thank our two brilliant speakers, Matthew Neal and Professor Marion Turner, for a wonderful and really thought-provoking session on a whole range of different questions this evening. Thank you also to our viewers at home and listeners for watching, for your comments, your questions. I'm sorry if I didn't get to them all, but thank you again for joining in this experiment in online community. I want to also stress that the Big Tent series would not be possible without the support, as it were, backstage of the amazing Torch team. So thank you all, and thank you specifically once again, Marion, and thank you, Matthew. Everyone else, although Marion and Matthew are clearly also very welcome, please join us next week for next week's Big Tent live event. Our theme next week is drama. And so on Thursday, the 30th of July, at the same time of 5 p.m, we're thrilled to be hosting a conversation with Professor Oliver Taplin, Emeritus Professor of Classics at Magdalen College in Oxford. And Oliver will be joined by BAFTA award-winning actor and director Fiona Shaw, CBE, and much else besides. Together, and in the last of the current series of our Big Tent online series, before, in other words, we take a short break for the month of August, Oliver and Fiona will be discussing tragedy and plague. But once again, thank you again to Matthew and Marion today. We hope you'll be able to all join us next week. Thank you again for watching, everyone, and goodbye for now.